Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to outline Hinge Epistemology, an approach to knowledge and justification that has its roots in Wittgenstein's book On Certainty. Now, I want to be clear from the outset that the goal of this video is not to explain Wittgenstein's own views, which are very much open to interpretation. Rather, we're going to look at how Hinge Epistemology has been developed in contemporary epistemology. I'm going to focus in particular on the work of Duncan Pritchard. Okay, so first of all, we need to consider skepticism. Hinge epistemology is often sort of initially developed, at least, as a response to skepticism. The skeptic aims to call into question all of our beliefs, or at least a very large class of our beliefs. So here's a classic argument for skepticism. If I don't know that not S, I don't know that P. I don't know that not S, so I don't know that P, where S is a skeptical hypothesis, like the hypothesis that I'm a brain in a vat, or that I'm dreaming, or that I'm a Boltzmann brain. You can see my previous video for a discussion of Boltzmann brains. P is a claim about the external world, like I have hands, right? If I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know that I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. In general, I don't know whether there are any external objects at all. If this argument is successful, it throws doubt on basically all our common sense beliefs about the external world. Now, it was noticed by philosophers like G.E. Moore that there is something a bit odd about this kind of argument. Moore responded that surely a proposition like I know I have hands is more certain, more secure than almost any other proposition. There's nothing that could be more obvious than that I know I have hands. So Moore argued that no philosophical argument, which, a philosophical argument will inevitably appeal to premises less certain than the premise, I know I have hands. No argument like that should lead me to reject the claim that I have hands. Moore famously responded to this by simply holding up his hands, saying, here's one hand, here's another, so there are two external objects, so the external world exists. You just sort of flip the argument around. Right, here's one hand, here's another, so clearly I'm not a brain in a vat. Again, I have a whole video discussing Moore's argument that I'll link in the comments. So it was this sort of Moorean kind of response that prompted Wittgenstein's initial reflections on certainty. Wittgenstein agreed with Moore that a proposition like I have hands is held with a kind of certainty. Even so, Wittgenstein felt that there was something odd about asserting the proposition I know that I have hands. And the key problem here is that in ordinary circumstances, claims that we have knowledge, or indeed that we fail to have knowledge, make sense only where there might be genuine doubt about what we claim to know, or where we can offer some sort of justification for what we claim to know. Like, if I say, I know that P, it's perfectly legitimate to then ask me, well, how do you know that P? What reasons can you cite to justify P? But in ordinary circumstances, these sorts of questions about doubt and reasons and justification, they just don't arise when it comes to a claim like, I have hands. I mean, what sort of possible justification could be given for the claim that I have hands? Well, when Moore responded to the skeptic, he simply held up his hands and said, here are two hands. So, Moore must be assuming that he can justify the claim that he has hands by perceiving his hands. And you might think, okay, yeah, well, surely, like if you ask for a justification for the claim that I have hands, then, well, I know that I have hands via perception, right? I perceive that I have hands. Maybe that's the justification. But Wittgenstein says there this isn't going to work because, well, as he says, I quote, if a blind man were to ask me, have you got two hands? I should not make sure by looking. If I were to have any doubt of it, then I don't know why I should trust my eyes. For why shouldn't I test my eyes by looking to find out whether I see my two hands? What is to be tested by what? So basically, if I were to have genuine doubt about whether or not I have two hands, then I wouldn't be able to rely on my visual impressions to test this because, if I'm calling into question the existence of my hands, if I'm calling into question something as obvious as that, then I'm also probably, I should also be calling into question the testimony of my eyes. I'm gonna call into question the testimony of anything else. Like the claim that I have hands is sort of, I'm just as certain of that as I am of the claim that my eyes are reliable. So, why shouldn't I instead doubt my eyes and then check that my eyes are working by looking to see whether I have two hands? I mean, this is actually something that we will sometimes do in circumstances where, our vision is impaired. Like if I'm in a fog or something, I might actually hold my hands out in front of me and look and find if I can see them, and then I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a really thick fog because I don't see my hands there. So, the point is that like the testimony of my if we're calling into question whether or not I have hands, I'm going to be calling into question whether or not my eyes are trustworthy. So I can't test whether or not I have hands by like looking to see whether or not my hands are there. At least that's not a genuine justification. So there's no way to test this proposition, I have hands. So questions of doubt can't really arise. I mean, there are situations, of course, where genuine doubt can arise. So if, for example, I have been in a serious car accident, I wake up in a hospital afterwards, I find that my arms are bandaged and I can't see my hands. In that situation, I might genuinely doubt whether I have hands. And since, I trust my visual perception, I can remove the bandages to confirm whether there are hands there. And this is, of course, a procedure that I can perform that resolves my doubt in that situation. But for the radical skeptic, there is no procedure that could resolve her doubt. There is nothing I can do, there's nothing I can perceive that would resolve the doubt about whether or not I have hands. Which for Wittgenstein means that that's not a genuine doubt at all. I mean, what would it be? What would it be to genuinely doubt whether I have hands? Well, maybe it would be that, I wouldn't flinch if I were to see a knife coming towards my hands. Of course, the external world skeptic doesn't give up these ordinary behaviours. If you start to try to stab her hands, she's going to move her hands. And if somebody really didn't flinch when they saw a knife coming towards their hands, no doubt their behaviour would quickly be corrected, right? The knife would hit their hands, they'd feel pain, and they'd start behaving accordingly. Okay, so with that in mind then, let's say that in ordinary circumstances I was to claim, I know I have hands. Well, what possible justification could be given for this? I mean, nothing, right? I can't justify that claim by saying that I see my hands, because if I'm doubting whether I have hands, then I'm not going to trust my eyes. So, I can't appeal to the testimony of my eyes. And the same goes for any other perceptual capacity. There's no justification available here. So, there's no justification. It seems that there's no real possibility of doubt. Like, for knowledge to be possible, there must be the space for doubt and justification. Like when I say I know that P, this is sort of presupposing the possibility that there are circumstances where I don't know that P, or maybe I don't know that P, right? And what I'm doing is giving a justification for P. Knowledge is based on evidential grounds. Like when I claim to know something, I must be able to cite evidence for it, and that evidence might be undermined, in which case my claim to knowledge would be undermined. So, in ordinary circumstances, the idea would be that knowledge claims are appropriate when we have, arrived at some claim through investigation, when we can ask questions like, how do you know? But when it comes to a claim like, I have hands, this sort of doubt and citing of evidence and investigation, this just isn't part of it, right? I don't investigate whether or not I have hands. I just do things with my hands. So, the idea is that I have hands has this sort of special status. It's a proposition with a very special status, or a claim with a very special status. It's a hinge commitment, or a hinge proposition. Wittgenstein calls these commitments hinges because they are the presuppositions around which the rest of our language and epistemic practices turn. The thought is that there are certain commitments that just have to be assumed in order for various practices to be possible. Just like the hinges of a door must stay in place in order for the door to stay up and to open and close. Like, in order for the door to turn, the hinges have to stay in place. Hinge commitments are required for practices, for various practices to be possible. In particular, hinge commitments are required in order for the practice of rational evaluation to be possible. So, like, rational evaluation would be like doubt, justification, giving evidence. In order for that practice to occur, there have to be certain commitments that are in place that make it possible. But this means that those commitments cannot themselves be subject to this rational evaluation. They cannot themselves be called into doubt. So like, rational evaluation involves doubt. Okay, I ask myself, could this proposition be false? Right? Like, I believe that all species share a common ancestor. Okay, but why do I believe that? Could that be false? Okay, then I start to engage in a rational evaluation. I search for reasons to accept or reject the proposition. Hinges must be exempt from this sort of doubt, because the very act of raising doubts and performing investigations is itself predicated upon these hinges. So, since hinge commitments are outside of rational evaluation, they do not themselves have any rational support. So we saw this in the case of I have hands. In ordinary circumstances, it wouldn't make sense to try to offer a justification for this claim. So hinge commitments are neither justified nor unjustified. They are neither known nor unknown, right? So they're not justified, they're not known. So actually, when I say something like, I know I have hands, that would be, again, in ordinary circumstances at least, that would be kind of, sort of a misuse of language, right? It would be, the mistake is that no, this just isn't, it doesn't have a kind of this sort of epistemic status. For the very same reason, they can't be doubted. If I was to ask a question like, what reason is there to believe a hinge commitment? That would be a mistake, because hinge commitments are what enable the giving of reasons. If I were to doubt whether I have hands, that would just call into question the whole practice of making claims or doubting claims. Like, even to doubt requires a background of assumptions, such as I have hands. And of course, this accounts for the special kind of certainty that is associated with hinge commitments. Hinge commitments cannot be doubted, but at the same time, we can't offer a compelling argument for them. The certainty of hinge commitments is not based on our being able to offer a proof for them. It's based on the fact that these are the presuppositions that make inquiry possible, or indeed that make our general form of life possible, our general practices possible. Okay, so let's sort of see this maybe with another example. So consider these two claims. So we have a claim like, there is milk in the fridge, and then we have a claim like, there are external objects. Now, in the case of there is milk in the fridge, there are very straightforward empirical procedures for establishing this, for establishing claim M here. I know what to do to test it one way or the other, okay? I go to the fridge, I open the door, I search for a bottle of a particular size and shape, and if I find such a bottle, I'm going to take it that M is true. I'll be like, okay, I've established that there is milk in the fridge. Now, obviously, further questions could be raised here. Like, how do I know that the bottle really contains milk? How do I know that, my brother isn't pulling some sort of prank and he's replaced the milk with something else? But again, there are straightforward procedures for answering such questions. If I am really questioning whether or not my brother has pulled this prank, I can, pour the liquid out of the bottle, and then I can taste it, and so on. So again, straightforward empirical procedures for testing this claim M. What about claim E, that there are external objects? Well, clearly this cannot be approached in the same kind of way. No observation could establish E. It won't help to take, a microscope and look through it. I'm not going to have a microscope and be like, okay, I've looked through the microscope and there it is, an external object. The difference, of course, is that in accepting that there are external objects, I'm not accepting a straightforward empirical claim. I'm accepting a sort of way of inquiring. I'm this is the sort of claim that allows me to gather evidence for and against other propositions. And so this is what this is a hinge commitment, right? Hinge commitments are what allow us to gather evidence for and against other propositions. So I might say something like, there are 3 chairs in this room, or I might say that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. I can assess evidence for these claims. Crucially, however, this evidence presupposes that there are external objects, and the evidence can't provide support to the hinge commitment, because the hinge commitment is what is making possible the gathering of evidence in the first place. So any justification given of a hinge commitment would be less firm than the hinge commitment itself. So I can cite evidence for the claim that the universe has existed for 13.8 billion years. Now, given that I am significantly younger than 13.8 billion years, this is going to entail that there are external objects. There are objects outside my mind, objects other than me. So U entails E. But U cannot be evidence for E. And evidence for U cannot be evidence for E, because the evidence that bears on U presupposes E. All the evidence in favour of U from physics and chemistry and astronomy and geology would make no sense without E. We can only bring claims about, so if I take the redshifting of starlight or something like that, well, that's only going to bear on the evaluation of U if we're assuming E. If I'm assuming that, there are these external objects and I'm not just, currently dreaming or whatever. So that's the idea of hinge commitments. So which propositions count as the hinge commitments? Well, different hinge epistemologists are going to have different answers to this, but there are some general answers we can give here. So that some hinge commitments are going to include sort of specific propositions about myself and my own experience, propositions that express the sort of basic pieces of evidence I have from my own experience, like I have hands, my name is Kane, I am speaking English, I have never been to the moon. Then there are going to be more general claims bearing on my sort of general worldview and how I form beliefs. So there is an external world, sense perception is reliable, reasoning is reliable, the universe is older than I am, and so on. Right, okay. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, where I upload bonus videos, where I offer my own thoughts about the topics I talk about on these videos, or a one-off donation on PayPal. I also offer private tutoring, so email if you're interested in that. Private tutoring in philosophy, and I have a Discord. Links to all this will be in the description. Right then, so we've seen the role that hinge commitments play in inquiry. But what exactly is the nature of these hinge commitments? Well, a standard interpretation is that hinge commitments are something like rules. They're not exactly, they have the form of descriptive propositions, but really they're more like rules. So as Wittgenstein says, their role is like that of rules of a game, and the game can be learned purely practically without learning any explicit rules. So yeah, a hinge commitment is going to appear to be a descriptive claim. Like if I say, I have hands, that has the appearance of merely describing the arrangement of objects in the world. It's like, okay, there's this thing, a hand, which is attached to this person, so it's a descriptive claim. But really, what's happening when we say something like, I have hands, is we're sort of stating conditions that must be in place in order for certain practices to occur, or we're stating the rules of certain practices. So under normal circumstances, I wouldn't explicitly say something like, I have hands. In philosophical contexts, we use this seemingly descriptive claim to express certain rules that govern our practices. And these rules are manifested in our actions. So when I was writing the script for this video, I was typing on my computer, and to do this, I had to have hands. I use my hands to type on the computer. And maybe I find that a letter doesn't come up, and then I wonder, like, oh, does this key still work? I try it again. I tap it with my hands, right? I'm using my hands. So my behavior with respect to the computer is governed by certain rules, and I need not be explicitly aware of these rules. Like, I don't have to consciously think to myself that I have hands in order to use my hands, right? Often I'll just use my hands. I won't sort of have some proposition in my head that says I have hands. I'll just use my hands. Indeed, this rule is not something that even has to be taught, at least not in the way that I was taught, say, the theory of evolution by natural selection. Like, I'm not taught the proposition that I have hands. I'm taught how to use my hands to do various things. And in being taught these practices, I adopt these rules, these hinge commitments. Danielle Moyle Sharrock put it like this: the hinge certainty, verbalized as I have a body, is a disposition of a living creature which manifests itself in her acting in the certainty of having a body. So the certainty is of these rules, the certainty of these rules, these commitments, is manifested in her actions. The fact that I'm acting just shows that I accept these rules, or that I'm conforming to these rules. And this is why, even when I recognize that there is no rational basis for the truth of the proposition I have hands, like even when I recognize that I have no reasons for this as a belief, my certainty in it is unchanged. It will continue to function as a rule that guides my behavior. I can notice that there's no rational basis for the belief that I have hands, and then I sit down and start typing things on my computer, right? So this approach gives voice to the worry that skepticism, as the philosopher conceives of it, is in some way inert or meaningless. So, as we noted earlier, there are circumstances where I will experience genuine doubt about whether or not I have hands, as when I wake up in a hospital bed after a car crash. I can resolve such doubts by applying certain standard empirical procedures that I've learned, like, looking under the bandages. And then I see the hands there, and I'm like, oh, I might say in relief, oh, I know I have two hands. Thank God, This isn't the kind of thing the skeptic is talking about, of course. The skeptic tries to ask for a rational justification of our whole worldview and tries to cast doubt on whether I have hands, even in ordinary contexts. But the skeptic's doubt, it's a doubt that makes no difference whatsoever. The skeptic doesn't change her actions. She continues to use her hands just as the rest of us do. And the skeptic doesn't propose any procedure for resolving the doubt. Indeed, by her lights, there can be no procedure for resolving the doubt because the skeptical hypotheses are designed to be consistent with all possible experience. So it's not really a doubt at all. I mean, I can ponder these skeptical arguments all I like, but at the end of the day, I still know how to use a keyboard, and it's this knowing how to use a keyboard that manifests the hinge commitment that I have hands. So that is the basic idea of hinge epistemology. Now, there are three immediate challenges to this kind of approach. So the first challenge is whether this sort of view actually provides a response to skepticism. We've talked about skepticism a lot and contrasted the hinge epistemologist with the skeptic, but we might worry whether the difference is as great as it seems to be. So notice that the hinge epistemologist identifies certain commitments as being the hinge commitments, and there are two relevant features of hinge commitments as the hinge epistemologist sees it. First, they are the presuppositions on which the rest of our inquiries are built. They're the hinges on which the rest of our practices turn. Second, they are not justified. They are not known. No reason can be given in support of them. No justification can be given for them. But then you might think, well, hang on a minute, isn't this exactly what a skeptic would say? Like, all of our beliefs rest on these presuppositions that cannot be justified. So all of our beliefs are ultimately unsupported. Now, of course, a hinge epistemologist will reject this final inference, right? All of our beliefs rest on propositions that cannot be justified. Sure, it does not follow that all of our beliefs are unsupported. we have to pay attention to what it means to give support to a belief. This is a matter of giving reasons, of engaging in investigation, of assuaging doubts. But this activity presupposes certain hinge commitments. The trouble is that even a skeptic might be willing to accept what we could call, conditional justification or conditional support. So the skeptic might accept that, look, if you take certain propositions for granted, say the proposition that perception presents a generally reliable picture of the external world, if I take that for granted, then I can give support to further propositions on that basis. Like, if we take P for granted, we can get ourselves to Q. The issue for the skeptic is that there's no justification for P. But then, like, where exactly is the line between the Hinge epistemology and the skeptic here? Is it just that they have, like, different attitudes to these presuppositions? So, like, both of them seem to agree that, okay, there are certain presuppositions that you can make, which, like, there are certain presuppositions we make, which, which then allows us to engage in further inquiry, which then makes possible all of these other practices, or which, like, if we take these presuppositions for granted, then, this practice of justification is possible. So, okay, looks like we both agree on that. And moreover, they both agree that these presuppositions are themselves without justification. Is it just that the Hinge epistemologist is okay with this, whereas the skeptic is not okay with it? Like, it's just a difference in attitude? So this is one sort of worry that, like, okay, maybe the line is starting to look quite thin. We'll come back to this point later. So, second challenge is that Hinge epistemology appears to be committed to epistemic relativism. Basic problem here is, well, it looks like people could adopt very different Hinge commitments, which would lead to different systems of justification. Suppose that Verity selects as a Hinge commitment that the Bible is the infallible word of God. Verity is fervently religious. She interprets all other practices in terms of her literal Christian faith, her literalist faith. As a result, she endorses young earth creationism as an account of the history of life. Now, since the Bible is a Hinge commitment for Verity, it's not open to doubt or justification, in which case it looks like there's no room for debate with Verity. Verity is not making any kind of rational error. All I can say is, well, we have different Hinge commitments, and our Hinge commitments are immovable. So, there's a worry that, like, Hinge epistemology seems to sort of close down rational inquiry. And there's also a worry that it sort of licenses a kind of just dogmatism. Like, we just end up accepting certain things, and they're kind of quarantined from criticism and justification. And of course, this only makes this spectre of skepticism more vivid, because we can recognise that Verity's Hinge commitments have led her to a radically mistaken view of the world. So we're like, okay, these Hinge commitments have led somebody massively astray, in which case we might wonder, well, why shouldn't that be the same for our own Hinge commitments then? Just insisting that Hinge commitments can't be open to doubt is not a particularly comforting response here. It's like there seems to be something defective about the way that Verity the creationist justifies her worldview. If I recognise that the only difference between us is that we happen to have different Hinge commitments, maybe my worldview is defective also. This is the worry. A third problem is that it seems that Hinge commitments can change over time and in response to new evidence. So I have hands is currently a Hinge commitment, but we've already seen that there are circumstances where I might genuinely come to doubt this. What is it that makes me doubt this? Well, it looks like it's the changing evidence. So, or think about a statement like, no human being has ever walked on the moon. That was a Hinge commitment prior to the 1960s. These days, we think it's simply false. Now, the trouble here is that it looks like what's happening is that these Hinge commitments are changing as a result of rational evaluation. So, when I wake up in the hospital bed with my arms bandaged and I can't feel my hands, in this situation, it's perfectly rational for me to doubt whether I still have hands. But it's like, okay, so I've received evidence which has now cast doubt on whether I have hands. But Hinge commitments are supposed to be exempt from doubt, exempt from rational justification. So how is it possible for Hinge commitments to change in this manner? that like giving up the belief that I have hands in that situation looks like an almost paradigmatic example of change due to rational evaluation. So how does the Hinge epistemologist account for this sort of case? Well, Duncan Pritchard has proposed an approach to Hinge epistemology that, he argues, solves many of these problems. Pritchard suggests that all Hinge commitments follow from a commitment to what he calls the uber-Hinge commitment. The uber-Hinge commitment is the proposition, I am not radically and fundamentally in error. This is the single basic Hinge commitment which all people must share. Other Hinge commitments are merely expressions of this more general uber-Hinge commitment. They are how the uber-Hinge commitment manifests in particular contexts. Suppose, for example, that it were, suppose it were somehow true that I don't have hands right now as I'm typing the script for this on the computer. In that case, I would have to be radically and fundamentally in error. Something would have gone deeply wrong with my belief-forming processes. But, I take it for granted that I'm not radically and fundamentally in error. I have to take this for granted in order to sensibly investigate anything. There would be no point undertaking an investigation if I could not trust my capacities to investigate. But I can only trust my capacities to investigate if I take it that I'm not radically and fundamentally in error. So this uber-Hinge commitment grounds the rest of my inquiries. The uber-Hinge commitment is universal. But of course, different circumstances in conjunction with the uber-Hinge commitment will lead us to form more specific Hinge commitments. My present circumstances lead to the Hinge commitment, I have hands. But if I were to wake up in the hospital bed, my circumstances would be different, so the uber-Hinge commitment would require different things of me. So this neatly deals with the problem that Hinge commitments seem to change over time, right? The uber-Hinge commitment remains in place. So like right now, I have hands, that's not open to genuine doubt, because to deny that I have hands, I'd have to take myself to be radically and fundamentally in error, contrary to the uber-Hinge. But this need not be the case in all possible circumstances, right? There are circumstances where I have hands could be genuinely doubted, but with the uber-Hinge still in place. What fundamentally cannot be doubted is the uber-Hinge. Pritchard argues that this understanding of epistemology, Hinge epistemology, allows us to address the challenge of relativism. So the key point is that not just anything can count as a Hinge commitment. In particular, merely having the attitude of certainty to a proposition does not make it a Hinge commitment. Our Hinge commitments are only those claims that manifest the uber-Hinge commitment. In a sense, this will still involve a kind of relativism, because there's the universal uber-Hinge commitment, and then other Hinge commitments will be relative to different circumstances. But crucially, this does not entail that disagreements are going to be rationally irresolvable. So take a case where two people are debating the same topic. So I'm debating whether creationism ought to be taught in schools as an alternative to the modern evolutionary synthesis. The creationist can say that she is certain of the Bible. Even so, that's not going to be a Hinge commitment. So both myself and the creationist clearly share various practices. These are going to be everyday behaviors like eating food, driving cars, and so on. We're both concerned with the education system of the same country. So we share a society, we share various practices within that society, so we must have a great deal of common ground. And of course, we both share the uber-Hinge commitment. We both take it, I am not radically and fundamentally in error. But in that case, we should expect substantial overlap in our beliefs about how the external world works, in our common sense beliefs about what we observe on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, the creationist can claim to be certain that the Bible is the infallible word of God, but mere certainty does not make something a Hinge commitment. Because, suppose the Bible turned out not to be the word of God. Would this mean that the creationist is radically and fundamentally in error? Well, no, because the vast majority of her beliefs and practices don't actually have anything to do with the Bible. When the creationist gets into a car and drives to the grocery store, her picture of the world is only tangentially related to the Bible, if related at all. So the real sort of challenge of relativism is the idea that there can be disagreements that cannot be rationally resolved. If you accept relativism, you have to grant that people with fundamentally different worldviews might be equally rational, and that there's nothing that we can say to them that would compel them, at least rationally compel them, to change their minds. But on Pritchard's view, everybody shares the same fundamental Hinge commitment, and everybody shares a variety of practices, which gives us significant common ground. So there's no reason to expect that I would be unable to present evidence to the creationist that would in fact connect with the creationist's worldview and that would rationally compel the creationist to agree with me. Appealing to the uber-hinge commitment can also appealing to the uber-hinge commitment can resolve the problem of changing hinges and the problem of relativism. What about skepticism, this big challenge? Well, here we run into the problem that the uber-hinge commitment is itself held without justification. So the Hinge epistemologist is going to need some other way to, distinguish her view from the skeptic. So as Pritchard sees it, skepticism assumes what he calls the universality of rational evaluation. Basically, the skeptic assumes that there are universal rational evaluations where all of one's beliefs are rationally evaluated all at once. What the skeptic tries to do is step outside of all inquiries, suspend all presuppositions, and give a general rational evaluation of all of them, bringing them all into doubt. When the skeptic says that a particular claim is not justified, this is a kind of rational evaluation. So the skeptical argument, it rests on the claim that, if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know that P, where, the argument asks us to consider the basis of any beliefs about the world, whether they be everyday beliefs or scientific beliefs or religious beliefs or anything else. Can the basis of our beliefs exclude skeptical scenarios like the brain in the vat scenario? It thereby seeks a universal rational evaluation of those beliefs. By contrast, the Hinge epistemologist proposes that Hinge commitments are exempt from rational evaluation. In particular, the uber-hinge, that uber-hinge commitment is non-optional. It's non-optional because, again, as we saw, in order for me to perform a rational evaluation, I must trust my rational capacities, so I must assume that I'm not radically in error. So it's perfectly legitimate to doubt particular beliefs in particular contexts. Where the skeptic goes wrong is that she tries to generalize this. She tries to doubt beliefs across the board. But why suppose that this is legitimate? I mean, that's a substantive theoretical assumption that the Hinge epistemologist denies. So as Pritchard puts it, I quote, "The locality of our everyday rational evaluations is not an incidental feature of these practices, as if we were merely lacking in time or imagination, but rather essential to what it is to undertake a rational evaluation." Okay, so the skeptic and the Hinge epistemologist agree that our Hinge commitments are groundless. Where they disagree is that the skeptic takes it that we can genuinely doubt such commitments and we can perform this rational evaluation of them. For the Hinge epistemologist, the groundlessness of such commitments is precisely what shields them from rational evaluation. In a sense, so there are two ways that a belief can fail to have justification. It might have no justification because it is unjustified, where, that's a negative rational evaluation. It might have no justification because it just has no status as either justified or unjustified, and that's what the Hinge epistemologist will say of our Hinge commitments. So, is that convincing? Well, here's just one worry. Although there are arguments for radical skepticism that target beliefs across the board, like Agrippa's trilemma, say, not all skeptical arguments are intended to be global. This is the case for the skeptical argument that we encountered earlier in this video, which aims to establish external world skepticism. It's not actually obvious in what sense this argument involves a universal rational evaluation, because this argument is only targeting a specific subset of our beliefs. Many beliefs, such as beliefs about logic, about mathematics, about my own mind, beliefs about, our trust in methods of inductive inference and so on, are not actually threatened by scenarios like the brain in the vat scenario, at least not obviously so. So we might object that really this is just another kind of local evaluation. Like the external world skeptic does not have to doubt the uber hinge commitment. So I can think that my rational capacities are perfectly reliable, that I have a good understanding of deductive and inductive inference, that I can reliably introspect my own mental states. It's just, well, turns out that the external world is not as it seems to be. So it's not, I don't know, it's not obvious that that would involve a doubt of the uber hinge commitment, right? Like maybe we might think that, yeah, I can have sort of better reasons. So, you know, perception is not perfectly reliable, obviously, right? Everybody accepts that. On the other hand, there are many other capacities beyond perception that I use for forming beliefs, and maybe those other capacities can cast greater doubt on perception, right? Why not? That seems to be what's going on in the argument for external world skepticism. Now, obviously, a Wittgensteinian would object to this solipsistic sort of picture, but the question is whether there's anything in Hinge epistemology in itself that rules this out. And certainly, if the issue with skepticism is that it tries to perform a universal rational evaluation, it's not clear that that's going to work as an objection to external world skepticism. All right then. Well, that was Hinge epistemology. So I'm going to leave the video there. I hope you found that interesting. And I will see you next time. Right. Goodbye.